Good afternoon, everyone. When I was first invited to come and speak today, I was invited to come up with a fairly informal, conversational style talk, and also one that was sort of from a personal perspective. And the thing that struck me immediately was that this is a really interesting moment for Brisbane, but also within Australia and then globally, just to consider and reflect upon the history and the popularity of fashion exhibitions, fashion collections and displays as they've developed over the years. So what I'm going to do is effectively go back in time and build up a bit of a history, a story to how we've got to the point we have today. We're in a leading contemporary art space in one of our major cities. Hundreds and thousands of people will come to see works such as these. So in terms of one of my first questions that I put to myself, it was around when fashion and textiles started to be collected in a museum and gallery context. And I suspect many of you would actually be surprised to learn that this goes way back, more than 100 years, in fact to the mid-19th century, where institutions like the Victoria and Albert Museum, for instance, in London, also collections in America, began collecting from the 1850s onwards. And indeed, the gallery that I work for, their collection began bringing in textiles and fashion works from the late 19th century. So the works themselves began coming in. I guess there's a big gap though between things being collected and then finding ourselves in a situation like we are today. So the next sort of evolution really was having specific collections or departments or even whole unique galleries and museums set up specifically to look at fashion history. And again, this begins earlier than many people would expect. Institutions, for instance, like the Fashion Institute of Technology, which is in New York, that began as a museum in about 1915, initially very much with a focus as an educational institution really, and using the collection as a way of helping to teach students, but nonetheless a very clear agenda to collect fashion and collect both historically and contemporary fashion. I guess flowing on from that then you start to think about, well, if these works are being collected, when were the first sort of exhibitions specifically of fashion and textiles? And interestingly, one of the first significant ones was actually in 1900, and that was at the International Exhibition in Paris. And it was very much from a historical perspective, basically, very much about educating the public on the history of costume and fashion. Some of those pieces were actually, I suppose, a bit more like a Madame Tussauds type approach, so sort of waxen figures with reproduction costumes to illustrate past historical styles, and then running through to what was, at the time, the contemporary couturiers of their day and what they were producing. In terms of the types of exhibitions that we're more familiar with now, that started to change over the 20th century, and initially certainly the focus tended to be on the history of fashion and a more chronological approach. But one of the important shifts, I guess, is when we started to see a focus on individual designers, and most significantly living designers. And in fact the first exhibition of that kind was in 1983 in New York, and that was an exhibition of the work of Yves Saint Laurent, who was obviously a living designer, and this was quite controversial and seen as quite a bold step forward. And this is one of the areas, I guess, that's quite interesting in terms of the display of fashion in gallery settings, is that it's often been queried and questioned about where the line between sort of commerce and the business side of fashion is, and then of course where the line in terms of artistic and craft and and aesthetic appeal might be. Exhibitions, as I mentioned, have come in different forms. Certainly there's the chronological style, there's thematic exhibitions where they might be grouped around a particular idea, a particular time period, and certainly you also have, in more recent times, exhibitions that even look at the industry of fashion itself. Currently at the Powerhouse in Sydney, there's an exhibition called Frock Stars, which is charting the evolution of the Australian Fashion Week, which is an event that's been going for 15 or so years now. And likewise in New Zealand a number of years ago, they did an exhibition looking at New Zealand Fashion Week and the key moments, the key collections and the key designers that have had their careers played out through events like that. Exhibitions of fashion, though, have had a broader appeal and a broader presence beyond merely galleries and museums. Certainly even auction houses now sell vintage fashion, and the way that they present and almost curate the works that are on sale to the public has become a form of exhibition itself. So this idea of presenting fashion in an exhibition has become something that a lot of people engaged with, and in fact contemporary designers themselves have increasingly looked for alternative ways to show their collections beyond, I guess, what most of us think of as being the runway or the catwalk style of presenting. Some of them, in fact, have chosen to have an installation or an exhibition approach. Some of them even make films as a way of presenting their collections.